Have you ever heard of a battle where no one brought any weapons? Not a metaphorical battle, mind you. Not a war of words or some quiet diplomatic standoff over tea and treaties. No, I mean a proper old-fashioned medieval battle. Banners flapping in the wind, soldiers lined in tidy rows, drums thumping like the heartbeat of the land, except quite inconveniently, no one remembered to bring so much as a butter knife. Strange, isn't it? And perhaps that's why so few speak of it. History books, you'll find, tend to prefer the clang of swords and the drama of kings. But this tale, this one lives in the hushed corners of sleepy villages, whispered beside low fires, passed down not by scholars, but by grandmothers stirring soup. It happened supposedly in a time not so clearly remembered. Some say the year was 1322. Others claim it was 1347. The truth is, nobody really knows. Not even the dusty old monastery ledger that usually recorded such things with great enthusiasm. You see, even the monks didn't know quite what to write when confronted with the facts. The facts, dear listener, are these. Somewhere in a little valley nestled between two hills, too shy to call themselves mountains, lay a region known as Thalendorf. It was an unremarkable place, which is probably why it was so beloved. The birds sang politely in the morning, the sheep stayed in their lanes, and the rain usually asked permission before it poured. This valley was home to two small fiefdoms, one to the east, one to the west, each ruled by a lord more proud than powerful, more pompous than perilous. Lord Adalbert of Trockenberg, ruler of the Eastern Hill, was a man who believed deeply in order tradition and his own cooking skills, particularly when it came to goose stew. Then there was Lord Torvald of Grunwald, ruling the Western Hill. He preferred flair celebration and seasoning. He too claimed to have invented the perfect goose stew. And therein, dear listener, lay the seed of all this ridiculousness. You see, it began not with the usual grievances of territory or marriage pacts, but with a stew. Yes, a goose stew. Both lords, in a fit of culinary ego, claimed to have created the original recipe known to the locals as Suppe des Goldenen Gänseschmaus, Golden Goose Glory Stew. At first, it was just banter, but as with all things involving pride and geese, it escalated. It started with posters, giant parchment signs nailed to trees, boasting Trockenberg's original golden stew, often imitated, never equaled. Grunwald responded with brass bands marching through the village square, playing a tune entitled, "The Only True Stew Lives in the West." Children began chanting stew slogans in the streets. Housewives began arguing at market stalls. Even the sheep grew tense. Eventually, and quite inevitably, letters were exchanged. Not warm letters, not neighborly notes, letters with wax seals and lots of words like disgrace, culinary theft, and utter hogwash. And then it happened. A challenge was issued. Lord Adalbert demanded satisfaction, and Lord Torvald, whose pride outweighed his sense, accepted. A field was chosen between the two hills. The banner carriers were summoned, the horns were polished, the foot soldiers were fed hearty breakfasts. A date was set. A battle was coming. But here is where things became odd. You see, in their haste to prepare for the Battle of the Stew Lords, as the bards later refused to call it, each side assumed the other would handle the armory arrangements. Lord Adalbert, ever focused on presentation, had instructed his staff to prepare banners, drums, embroidered tunics, and a selection of snack tables. Lord Torvald, enchanted by the idea of winning with flair, ordered a team of acrobats, 3 goats in matching armor, and several barrels of cherry cider. Neither side, however, remembered to bring swords, or axes, or even pointy sticks. Somehow, nobody noticed. The soldiers lined up. The horns blew. The banners unfurled. Everything looked wonderfully martial, until the captains on each side turned to their troops and asked, "Ready your weapons." And there was silence. A long, slow silence. The kind that stretches across fields and makes even the grass start to sweat. One soldier raised a soup ladle. Another held up a wooden spoon, blinking uncertainly. Someone, somewhere, offered up a large onion as a possible missile. But swords? No. Not a single one. It would have been embarrassing if it weren't so incredibly absurd. And that, dear listener, is how it all began. This story is not about bloodshed. It is not about valor or sacrifice. It is perhaps about ego, or forgetfulness, or the inexplicable way in which grown men in shiny boots can arrive at a battlefield with marching bands, but not a single blade. But most of all, it is a story about what happens when pride meets absurdity, and nobody thinks to double-check the packing list. So if you're cozy now and your blanket is pulled just right under your chin, settle in, because the tale of the most peculiar battle is just getting started. And I promise not a drop of blood will be spilled. Only perhaps a few ladles of soup. Before we proceed, let me reassure you, yes, there will be vegetables. And no, they won't be harmed much. Now then, where were we? Ah, yes, 2 proud lords, 1 innocent stew, and a valley bracing for something between a war and a very large misunderstanding. To understand how a bowl of goose stew could spiral into a military engagement, we must first examine the 2 men at the center of this gastronomic quarrel. First, Lord Adalbert of Trockenberg. Adalbert was a man with a rigid mustache and an even more rigid sense of pride. His castle sat atop the eastern hill, made entirely of square towers and rectangular windows, as though he didn't trust curves. His days began precisely at 5:03 a.m., with a cold wash and an evaluation of his goose flock, which he believed were the finest in all the region. He didn't smile often, unless someone complimented his seasoning technique. He considered his goose stew slow-cooked in rosemary and wild garlic, with a splash of plum vinegar to be his legacy. Some lords built statues. Adalbert built stock. Then there was Lord Torvald of Grunwald across the valley on the western hill. Where Adalbert was rigid, Torvald was theatrical. His robes swirled with unnecessary embroidery. His castle featured balconies built purely for dramatic announcements. He held weekly festivals for things like the Day of Parsley and the Spring of the Pickled Turnip. His goose stew, according to his own ballads, was the spoonful of the sun, a rich saffron-colored delight laced with honeyed carrots and a secret blend of 11 herbs, most of which he forgot regularly. Torvald didn't just believe his stew was superior, he believed it was art, served with sprigs of wild thyme and fanfare. He once made a pigeon cry from joy, or perhaps confusion, after tasting it. The stirring of trouble and stock. As with many disputes between neighbors, the stew scandal started small. It began one foggy morning when a merchant named Otto the Onion Trader made an offhand comment at market. Honestly, I prefer Lord Adalbert's stew. You can really taste the discipline. This got back to Lord Torvald before sunset. The very next day, the town square was graced with a procession led by a man in a goose costume holding a banner that read, "Grunwald's stew where flavor has honor." Adalbert, furious at what he called culinary slander of the highest degree, responded with a statue erected outside his keep, a bronze goose ladling soup into a golden chalice. The plaque read, "The True Original, 19." A day later, Torvald held a theatrical reading of a poem titled "Stew Lies in the East," accompanied by interpretive dance. And on the 7th day, they each sent an envoy across the valley, one with a letter, the other with a steaming bowl of stew. Neither was well received. Adalbert claimed the stew had too much clove. Torvald said the letter smelled like arrogance, and thus the gloves were off, or rather, the aprons. The official declaration, the declaration of battle, was elaborate. Lord Adalbert had it carved into a slab of elder wood and delivered by a man on stilts, accompanied by a somber choir of 5. The message was direct: to Lord Torvald, pretender of poultry and defiler of broth. You have defamed the art of proper stew. I challenge you to meet me upon the field of weeping turnips at dawn, 1 fortnight hence. Let truth be ladled at last. Torvald replied in kind by releasing a goose into the skies with a note tied to its leg. To Lord Adalbert, salt merchant of Trockenberg, you wouldn't know balance if it danced upon your tongue. Very well. Let broth speak louder than words. May the finest goose win. Historians later agreed the goose had absolutely no idea what was going on, but it did land gracefully on Adalbert's breakfast table the next morning, earning an awkward silence from his staff. The valley reacts. The people of Thalendorf didn't quite know how to feel. On one hand, it was rare for any sort of military engagement to occur in their sleepy valley. On the other hand, they were being asked to prepare for battle over soup. Still, orders were orders, and both sides began to muster their forces. Unfortunately, due to years of peace and a strong local preference for embroidery and goat herding, the term forces was applied generously. Adalbert's army consisted of 3 dozen footmen, half of whom also worked as cobblers, a retired knight named Gregor the Persistent, mostly persistent in falling asleep in his armor, and 2 scribes who insisted on documenting every moment as if writing an epic. Torvald's troops were different. A small troop of minstrels who insisted on composing battle songs mid-step. 4 archers with excellent vision but terrible aim, and a cook named Beatrix, who insisted on bringing her own spice rack into combat. Neither army trained much, but they did rehearse their marching formations. Torvald even choreographed a spinning entrance, which, to be fair, looked quite nice from afar. Final preparations. As the fated day drew near, the villagers whispered in alleys and over stew pots of their own. Will there be blood? Will there be victory? Will they bring bread? What no one suspected, and what neither army double-checked, was whether anyone had actually packed weapons. But we'll get to that in good time. For now, know this. 2 lords stood firm in their castles, gazing across the valley, stirring their final pots, with a sense of purpose that bordered on the absurd. They believed history would remember them, and in a way, it has. just not quite how they imagined. So the day finally came, the 15th morning after the declarations. The sun rose slowly over the misty valley of Thalendorf, yawning through the clouds, as if it too wasn't quite sure whether this was really happening. Down in the meadows between the two hills, the famous field of weeping turnips dew clung to the grass like nervous spectators. A single bird chirped once, then wisely decided not to get involved. And then, horns. Not war horns, really. Not the brassy thunder of battle cries you might expect in the background of a heroic tale. No, these horns sounded cheerful, almost like a traveling puppet troupe had just arrived in town, which, in fairness, they nearly had. From the east came Lord Adalbert's army, clad in neat, if slightly over-ironed tunics, each bearing his sigil, a goose ladling soup into a bowl, shaped suspiciously like his own head. Their boots were polished, their banners stiff, and their expressions well-decidedly unsure. At their front marched Sir Gregor the Persistent, who at 63 years of age had outlived most of his teeth and all of his patience. He rode a mule named Barbara, who was far more interested in grazing than glory. Behind them, a cart rattled with carefully stacked crates labeled things like silver serving ladles, tasting spoons, decorative chairs, folding for diplomacy, and yes, not a single sword. Meanwhile, in the west, from the opposite hill, Lord Torvald's forces made a far more dramatic entrance. Torvald insisted on timing their descent to a musical crescendo played live by his personal minstrels. Unfortunately, the drum player had fallen behind to flirt with a goose herder, so the entire army wobbled awkwardly down the hill to the offbeat rhythm of a lute solo and two men clapping. Their banners were more flamboyant than Adalbert's, featuring a golden goose wearing a monocle and winking. Some soldiers wore capes. One had a feather boa. Another twirled as he walked. Torvald himself followed in a wagon covered with lavender-scented cushions, sipping goose broth from a goblet and waving like he was already victorious. Today, he proclaimed, "We season history." The only thing missing, of course, was any kind of weapon. No one notices yet. The two armies approached one another across the meadow, slowly, politely, as if each side was trying to make sure they didn't step on any wildflowers. Lords Adalbert and Torvald emerged from their entourages at nearly the same moment, flanked by scribes, standard-bearers, and confused footmen. They locked eyes, they frowned. Then, as was tradition, they began their ceremonial accusations. "You, sir," said Adalbert, voice sharp as a whisk, "have diluted the honor of stew-making with honeyed carrots." "And you," Torvald retorted, adjusting his feathered collar, "have boiled away every trace of imagination from the broth. It tastes like wet resignation." Gasps rippled through their followers. A sheep sneezed. Somewhere, a goose honked dramatically. Then came the moment. Torvald turned to his captain and nodded. "Prepare the troops for combat." Adalbert mirrored the gesture. "Ready the men." The captains both turned to their ranks and shouted the time-honored phrase, "Raise your weapons," and nothing happened. A few soldiers fumbled with their belts. One young man sheepishly held up a soup ladle. Another tried to brandish a pepper grinder, but dropped it in the grass. One particularly confused cobbler raised a baguette. Lord Adalbert blinked. Where are the swords? His captain cleared his throat and mumbled, "We thought the blacksmiths were still on holiday." Lord Torvald, equally perplexed, gestured toward his men. "Did no one bring anything?" A voice from the back of his line piped up. "I brought a cheese slicer, sir." There was a pause. Then another voice, more hopeful, said, "I've got a pastry brush." A long, awkward silence settled over the meadow. The minstrels tried to play something dramatic, but it came out sounding like a tavern lullaby. Barbara the mule wandered into the middle and began chewing on Torvald's banner, collective realization. At first, neither side wanted to admit what was obvious. They had come all this way under banners of pride and ego, only to realize no one had remembered to pack the weapons. It wasn't entirely anyone's fault, really. Adalbert's quartermaster had been so focused on organizing cutlery and napkin holders that he'd assumed the squires would handle the swords. The squires busy polishing pewter soup bowls had assumed the knights would bring them. The knights, having long retired, were mostly concerned with not getting grass stains. Torvald's forces had their own confusion. His cook had packed 17 jars of saffron, 4 dozen ceramic bowls, a candle shaped like a goose, and exactly 0 spears. His warriors were mostly festival performers who thought this was a rehearsal for a new opera. A quiet voice, no one's sure whose, finally said what everyone was thinking. Should we still fight? A pause in the chaos. There they stood. 2 armies, hundreds of boots planted on soft grass, a row of banners fluttering in the breeze, and not a single actual weapon between them. Lord Adalbert cleared his throat. "This is clearly a strategic delay." Torvald nodded solemnly. "Indeed, a test of discipline and restraint," Adalbert added quickly. "Yes, absolutely. Restraint." The soldiers nodded slowly, as though trying to agree before anyone asked follow-up questions. What happens when you can't fight? At this point, no one quite knew what to do. They'd marched, they'd insulted each other, they'd followed protocol. But now they were standing in a field full of picnic supplies and conflicting emotions. One of Torvald's footmen pulled out a jug of cherry cider and took a sip. Then another. Then he offered some to a nearby scribe from Adalbert's camp. She took it. A few more men crossed the invisible border between the 2 camps to chat. Someone unpacked a loaf of rye bread. A cheese wheel was rolled down a hill for fun. A goose laid an egg in the shadow of a banner. The tension dissolved like salt into stew. And that, dear listener, is how the first stage of the battle came to an end without so much as a scratch, a bruise, or even a raised voice. Only a single silent understanding they had all forgotten something very important. And maybe, just maybe that wasn't the worst thing in the world. The situation was, as it often is in history's quieter corners, delicately ridiculous. On one hand, 2 opposing forces had assembled in full regalia trumpets and all ready to wage war over a goose stew recipe. On the other hand, no one brought weapons, not even a fork sharpened in defiance. And so for the first full hour of this battle, everyone just stood around awkwardly, like 2 troops of actors waiting for a director who never showed up. The sun climbed gently over the valley. Bees hummed. Someone sneezed. A lute player tried to improvise a song, but gave up halfway, and began whittling a spoon instead. Then, without any grand speeches or banners, flapping dramatically in the wind. It happened. The incident of the tomato. A soldier not particularly important, not particularly tall, reached into his lunch sack, pulled out a tomato, and lobbed it half-heartedly toward the other side. Not with malice, not even with much strength, just a slow, lazy arc. The tomato landed with a satisfying splort square on the chest of one of Torvald's banner carriers, a young man named Gerd, who had just polished his goose-embroidered tunic. He blinked, looked down, touched the mess now sliding down his chest. Then very calmly he reached into his own basket, took out a boiled beet, and hurled it back. It struck a scribe from Adalbert's camp squarely in the hat. Gasps echoed across the field. One soldier from the east dropped his spoon, and then someone shouted the 3 words that would go down in legend. Vegetables, it is then. The vegetable war begins. Suddenly the entire battlefield was alive, not with clashing steel or battle cries, but with the thud, squish, and plop of flying produce. Cabbages rolled like cannonballs. Turnips flew end over end through the air. One tomato was launched with such enthusiasm that it soared clean over both armies and landed in a pot of soup, still simmering by a campfire. Both sides, it must be said, were not particularly accurate. Most of the carrots landed harmlessly in the grass. Several squashes bounced harmlessly off helmets. One potato rebounded off a shield, startling a nearby chicken. But the noise. Oh, the noise. It was less the clang of battle and more the sound of a confused food fight at a medieval market day. The invention of the cabbage. Shield 1. Particularly clever footman from Trockenberg named Ansel had the idea of strapping a flat cabbage to his forearm and using it to deflect incoming onions. It worked somewhat. Soon others followed suit, fashioning makeshift defenses from turnip crates, bread loaves, and one very resilient cheese wheel that was rolled back and forth between both sides as a form of passive resistance. Lord Adalbert, witnessing his forces engage in what looked suspiciously like aggressive picnicking, turned to Sir Gregor and muttered, "This is not exactly what I imagined when I said we'd leave a mark on history." To which Gregor replied, "Well, we're certainly leaving stains." The epic of the eggplant cavalry. Meanwhile, over on Torvald's side, a small group of jesters originally brought along for morale decided to escalate things theatrically. They mounted barrels and rode them into the field, waving leeks like lances and wearing hollowed-out watermelons as helmets. Their charge was short. One of the barrels tipped over. Another got stuck in a shallow dip in the grass. But the image was immortalized in a local tapestry years later, labeled boldly, "The Gallant Advance of the Eggplant Brigade." A surprising turn of mood. Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, something unexpected began to unfold. Laughter, not the mocking kind, not the cruel, triumphant roar of conquerors, but real, genuine, belly-wobbling laughter. Soldiers who'd been hurling onions moments before were now doubled over watching a goat from Grunwald eat Lord Adalbert's hat. A scribe with beets stuck in his boots stood beside a minstrel with mashed parsnip in his beard, both shaking with amusement. The air, which had once trembled with the weight of insult and ego, now shimmered with a warmth more common at harvest festivals than battlefields. Lords at a loss. Both Adalbert and Torvald watched all of this with increasing confusion. They had come here to defend honor, to settle a centuries-old culinary question, to finally determine which goose stew was truly original. And now, their soldiers were swordless, their banners smeared with root vegetable debris, and their captains currently comparing spice preferences near a soup pot. Adalbert sighed deeply. I fear this war has gotten out of hand. Torvald adjusted his sleeves. On the contrary, I think it may be the first war that's gone exactly right. A pause, then a shrug, then a nod. Then both men slowly, cautiously sat down on opposite tree stumps and reached for a bowl of broth. The great cease fling. It took a little while for the flying food to stop completely. There were still a few stray radishes and an unusually persistent carrot that bounced off 3 helmets before retiring with dignity. But eventually both sides lowered their bread shields. Someone waved a parsnip in surrender, and in place of battle lines, picnic blankets began to appear. The first salvo was over, and while no one could declare victory, few could deny the outcome was deliciously peaceful. And so, dear listener, the world witnessed the only known conflict in history where the opening shot was a tomato, and the only casualty was a belt buckle ruined by mustard. The records may not remember their names, but the valley remembers the laughter. And the stew was by all accounts quite good that day. The battle, such as it was, had ended. No trumpet of surrender had sounded. No treaties were signed. There were no victors, no prisoners, no declarations carved into stone. Just a slow, slightly embarrassed silence that settled over the field of weeping turnips like the scent of roasted garlic on a still afternoon. Somewhere in the grass, a rutabaga lay forgotten. A piece of onion skin fluttered from a soldier's boot. And not far from the center of the field, a wheel of cheese rolled to a dignified stop. And then something shifted, not in the air, but in the stomachs. The first rumble. It began quietly, a single rumble from a squire's belly. Then another, and then another. After all, it was nearly noon. And despite the adrenaline and the radish-wielding theatrics of the morning, no one had actually eaten yet. One of Torvald's archers pulled a heel of bread from his pouch and tore off a piece. Seeing this, a Trockenberg footman cautiously stepped closer and offered him a smear of goose liver pâté. The archer paused, looked around, accepted, and thus began what came to be known, depending on who you asked, as either the most unexpected ceasefire or the tastiest surrender in history. The blankets appear. The cooks, who had been standing on the sidelines in confusion for most of the morning, suddenly found themselves elevated to positions of great importance. Campfires were rekindled. Iron pots were retrieved. Someone uncovered a stack of wooden bowls with little carvings of smiling turnips. Food that had been packed for post-victory feasts was now being prepared not for conquerors, but for everyone. A few brave souls from either side met in the middle of the field and began clearing a wide patch of grass. Blankets were unfurled. Tables were improvised from crates' shields, and one retired bard lying flat on his back. Someone set down a pot of lentil stew. Another added roasted parsnips with honey glaze. Soon came fried leeks, pumpkin mash, barley cakes, and cider. And in the center of it all, 2 steaming pots of goose stew. One from the east, one from the west, sitting side by side, bubbling quietly, as if none of this nonsense had ever happened. Suspicion and spoons! At first the lords held back. Lord Adalbert stood stiffly, arms crossed over his chest, eyeing the western stew pot as if it were likely to insult his mother. Lord Torvald was no better, sipping his cider with a raised brow and muttering under his breath about garlic misuse. But then came the Spoons, a young girl from the nearby village. No one remembered her name. Only her pigtails and serious expression walked right up to the two pots, dipped a ladle into each, and took a thoughtful sip. She said nothing, just nodded, then walked away, leaving both lords frozen with curiosity. Moments later, a knight approached, then a minstrel, then a goat herder with a spoon tucked behind his ear. One by one, they tasted both stews, and one by one, they smiled the same sleepy, satisfied smile. The tasting of truth. Finally, the moment could be delayed no longer. Lord Adalbert clearing his throat in the way only a prideful man swallowing ego can approach the stew pot that was not his. He ladled carefully, blew gently, sipped. His face for a full 5 seconds remained unreadable. Then he turned to Torvald and said, "You used time. Bold." To which Lord Torvald replied, "And you plum vinegar. Unexpected." A pause, then, as if following a secret signal known only to men who've never admitted to being wrong, before they both dipped bread into each other's stew and nodded with slow, dignified approval. That was as close to a truce as anyone was going to get. Banquet in the field. What followed next could not reasonably be called a battle nor even a feast. It was something in between, something gentler. A gathering, perhaps. Soldiers from both sides sat shoulder to shoulder, trading bites of their rations, laughing about missed throws and particularly dramatic tomato splatters. Someone brought out a fiddle. Another produced a tambourine. Soon music floated above the field light, meandering perfectly out of tune. An impromptu contest emerged. Who could carve the best vegetable figurine? A turnip knight won second place. First place went to a radish carved to look like Lord Torvald. He pretended to hate it but kept it in his satchel. Even the animals joined in, sort of. Barbara the mule wandered from bowl to bowl, gently nosing at biscuits and occasionally stealing a nibble. A goose from Torvald's banner parade tried to mate with Adalbert's ceremonial helmet. No one stopped them. What the villagers saw from a distance. The villagers who had come to watch the historic battle weren't quite sure what to make of it. They had brought folding stools and mulled wine, expecting at least a minor skirmish. Instead, they found a scene of surprising charm, warriors with onion rings on their fingers, rival lords comparing stew notes, and a pair of soldiers slow dancing awkwardly near the cider jug. One old woman squinted and muttered, "I thought this was supposed to be war." Her husband replied, "Maybe it's what war should be." End of the day. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the valley, the feast wound down. The fires burned slower. The laughter softened. Some men leaned back on their elbows, hands on full stomachs, gazing up at the clouds. Others drifted toward their respective camps, not out of division, but out of habit. Some stayed in the field wrapped in cloaks, gently snoring beside strangers they'd fought that morning. Torvald and Adalbert, having agreed to a mutual stew exchange program under very specific labeling conditions, sat on a log, sipping cider in silence. At last, Adalbert murmured, "Do you think history will record any of this?" Torvald shrugged. "Probably not." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But I hope someone dreams about it." And with that, The field of weeping turnips fell into a peaceful hush, not of defeat, but of full bellies and empty grudges. The valley was different the next morning. Not dramatically, so no walls had been torn down, no flags replaced, no treaties signed with a flourish of ink and ego. No, the difference was quieter than that. It lingered in the air like wood smoke from last night's fire. It hummed in the soft snoring of soldiers sleeping in patchwork clusters on the grass. And it shimmered faintly on the morning dew, which now carried the subtle scent of thyme, roasted parsnips, and distant laughter. The field of weeping turnips, once imagined as a place of clashing swords and noble cries, now looked more like the aftermath of an unusually festive farmer's market. Signs of peace and potatoes, little signs were everywhere. A single wooden spoon, broken at the handle, had been stuck upright in the earth like a tiny white flag. A cabbage, dented but not destroyed, had been placed gently atop a helmet like a crown. Two boots, mismatched, rested side by side under a folded blanket, shared by men from opposite sides. The goat that had caused mild confusion during the eggplant cavalry's charge now slept curled against a retired knight from Trockenberg, both snoring softly. And in the middle of it all, the two stew pots, one from the east, one from the west, sat empty. Their contents completely devoured their bottoms, blackened by fire, and their rims lined with polite bite marks. A different kind of wake-up call. The sun rose slowly, not in any rush, to disturb what had become an accidental campout. Birds chirped lazily from tree branches. A squirrel darted through the scene and paused briefly as if confused by the snoring tapestry of armor blankets and vegetables. Then somewhere near the eastern side, a squire named Felix sat up with a soft groan and blinked. He yawned, scratched his head, looked around, and said quite sincerely, "Did we win?" A nearby minstrel, using a bundle of parsley as a pillow, replied, "I think we all did, except maybe the rutabagas." Felix blinked again and nodded, accepting this as truth. Lords, in the morning, Lord Adalbert awoke stiffly. He had insisted, of course, on sleeping slightly apart from the others, with his banner rolled up beneath his head, and his ceremonial boots placed neatly side by side. But his back disagreed with this choice. With some effort and several quiet groans, he sat up and looked across the field. Lord Torvald, in contrast, was already awake and doing morning stretches. His robe wrinkled his hair, even more dramatic than usual. They nodded to each other. No words, just nods. Then Torvald walked over, holding 2 mugs of lukewarm cider. He handed one to Adalbert, and that perhaps was the most powerful diplomatic gesture of the entire conflict. Clearing the field. As more soldiers stirred and sat up, the mood remained surprisingly calm. There was no rush to rebuild lines or resume hostilities. No one looked for their ranks or worried about drills. Instead, they quietly began cleaning up. Bread crusts were gathered. Crushed turnips were gently scooped into baskets for composting. Someone began folding the blankets. Someone else created a game involving tossing carrot tops into a helmet. And as the valley stretched and yawned under the golden sun, there was a sense, however vague, that something meaningful had happened. Something that didn't require recording in a ledger or carving into stone. Just something human. The villagers returned. By mid-morning, a few curious villagers crept down the hill to see what had become of the great battle. They found no carnage, no broken shields or smoking wreckage. Instead, they found a long table made of stacked crates and shields, covered with leftover Rolls herb bundles and the remains of a slightly lopsided vegetable carving of Lord Adalbert. The villagers were, as always, adaptable. They brought more bread, more cider, a wheel of cheese large enough to seat a small child. Children played with dulled turnip spears. Elders pulled up stools and began telling their own versions of what had really happened. And someone, of course, began sketching a scene for posterity, though it would later be mocked for making the goat too handsome. The unexpected accord. Around noon, Lords Adalbert and Torvald convened this time not in private, not in armor, but seated on opposite sides of a shared wooden crate, using flat stones as plates and soup bowls as helmets for shade. They discussed in surprisingly civil tones the possibility of creating a joint stew recipe. Not a merger, Adalbert clarified. Of course not. Torvald agreed. A collaboration. They argued gently over the ratio of garlic to rosemary. There was minor disagreement about whether chestnuts belonged in stew. They did not. Adalbert was quite firm, but in the end, they agreed to begin work on a recipe of truce to be shared with both their households and the public, provided it came with proper footnotes and neither name appeared in larger font. A shift in the wind. And so the great battle ended, not with a bang, but with a bubbling pot, and two lords agreeing tentatively awkwardly that perhaps goose stew was never meant to divide anyone. The wind shifted. Geese flew overhead. The bells of a nearby chapel rang softly in the distance, as if signaling something more than the hour. No one packed up in haste. No one stormed away in offense. Instead, the field slowly returned to what it had always been, a meadow of wildflowers, soft hills, and the gentle rustling of leaves. History asleep. Historians, of course, didn't quite know what to do with this event. Some ignored it. Others misinterpreted it. One famously insisted that the so-called vegetable skirmish of Thalendorf was metaphorical despite the still visible turnip dents in a nearby oak. But in the valley, people remembered. They remembered the laughter, the silliness, the shared cider, the moment when pride gave way to play, the field where war forgot to happen. And they told the tale softly in kitchens and inns, over soup pots and bedtime stories. So, dear listener, if you ever find yourself on the edge of anger, holding a carrot instead of a sword, perhaps you are exactly where you need to be. Because sometimes peace begins with an empty stew pot and a nod across a quiet field. By now it was clear that no swords would be drawn, no arrows loosed, and no flaming catapults launched across the valley. The Battle of Thalendorf had quietly curdled into something far more peculiar, a collaboration between two lords who only the day before had been prepared to duel over soup. And as everyone knows, when two powerful men agree to stop fighting, they must immediately find a parchment large enough to document their agreement, preferably in dramatic handwriting. And so began the slow, meandering, and occasionally hilarious creation of the most unusual document in medieval history, the Stew Treaty of Thalendorf. The scribes assemble. The process began innocently enough. Lord Adalbert summoned his two best scribes, Hugo the meticulous and Marta the frequently irritated, to begin drafting a formal peace document. Lord Torvald, not to be outdone, brought his own chronicler, a flamboyant calligrapher named Elric, who wore a feathered hat so wide it needed its own chair. Together, the four of them sat beneath a canopy made from two crossed banners and began their work. Or tried to. Paragraph 1. The argument begins. Elric, who insisted on using purple ink for aesthetic integrity, opened with a dramatic flourish. Let it be known throughout the lands of Thalendorf that peace hath been declared between the eastern hill of Trockenberg and the western hill of Grunwald, and that all who lift a spoon shall do so in harmony. Hugo frowned immediately. Why hath and not has? This isn't a poem, Elric scoffed. It's not a poem. Marta sighed and began writing her own version beneath the table. Can we just say both parties agreed to stop flinging vegetables? Adalbert and Torvald, seated nearby, sipping lukewarm broth, began arguing over whether harmony sounded too musical. The goats watched with great interest. The naming debate. One of the longest arguments was about what to actually call the treaty. Torvald suggested the glorious broth accord, the culinary concord of the century, the golden goose pact. Adalbert responded with the resolution of reasonable recipes, the document of stewed understanding, or simply the treaty. Eventually, after a lunch break and a brief interruption, when someone spilled ink on a beet, they settled on the stew treaty of Thalendorf. Why? Because it was just ridiculous enough to be accurate. And because Marta wrote it in big letters on the top of the page when no one was looking. The clause conundrum. Now came the difficult part, the clauses. Clause 1 was easy. Neither party shall claim sole ownership of the goose stew recipe, hereafter referred to as Golden Goose Glory Stew. Clause 2 added, each party may prepare and serve the stew with minor variations provided. Those variations are clearly labeled as regional interpretations. Clause 3 sparked trouble. It read, under no circumstances shall raisins be added to the stew. Torvald was outraged. What if someone enjoys a touch of sweetness? Adalbert pounded the table. Raisins are treachery in fruit form. After a lengthy debate, they compromised with raisins may be added in private settings, but must be disclosed in writing before public consumption. This clause would later become a minor legend of its own, and would inspire the Thalendorf saying, as hidden as raisins in stew. The marginal notes. Elric insisted on adding decorative illustrations to the margins, one of a smiling goose, one of two spoons crossed like swords, and one very elaborate drawing of Torvald in a robe stirring a cauldron while being admired by forest animals. Marta, unimpressed, added a tiny drawing of a beet, frowning in the opposite corner. Hugo tried to remove them both, spilled more ink, and left a blotch that everyone eventually decided looked like a turnip. Thus, it stayed. The great ink shortage. Midway through the final draft, they ran out of ink. Ordinarily, this would have been a small problem. But Elric refused to write in black ink. It's emotionally flat. And Hugo refused to write in anything that wasn't approved by the Monastery of Historical Accuracy. Marta walked off to nap under a tree. A solution finally arrived in the form of Beatrix the camp cook, who offered a small bottle of boiled-down blackberry reduction. It was sticky, faintly sweet, and surprisingly legible. The final signature page of the treaty, therefore, has a distinct fruity smell even to this day. The signing ceremony. When the treaty was finally ready, inked, illustrated, argued, and sighed over, it was time to sign. The crowd gathered at the center of the field. 2 barrels were rolled forward to serve as a table. A ceremonial napkin was laid across them, and the parchment, still slightly damp from blackberry glaze, was placed in the center. Lord Adalbert signed with his full name title and the added note, "May this stew always simmer in peace." Lord Torvald added his signature with a small drawing of a ladle. Martha Hugo and Elric signed below, along with various soldiers, villagers, and 1 goose, who walked across the page with muddy feet, leaving what many claim to be an official stamp of approval. A new kind of law. The Stew Treaty of Thalendorf was not copied into great volumes. It was not sent to the king, nor discussed by scholars in distant towers. But it was posted on the door of the village bakery, and people came to read it, and chuckle, and nod. For in its rambling paragraphs, purple ink swirls and raisin regulations, they saw something rare. A moment when pride gave way to laughter, when stew ended a war, and when 2 lords remembered they were also men who got hungry. So if you ever pass through the valley of Thalendorf and catch the scent of roasted goose on the wind, remember this: once upon a time 2 armies marched to war and came home with a recipe. One would think that after such a thoroughly absurd event as the great unarmed Battle of Thalendorf, everyone involved would quietly return to their lives with a vow never to speak of it again. One would be wrong, because in the weeks that followed the non-war, something curious began to take root in the valley. Something warm, fragrant, and ever so slightly ridiculous. It began as all good things do with a goose. A real goose, named Martha. The first honk of celebration. Martha had wandered onto the battlefield during the treaty signing, honked once loudly, and promptly sat down in front of the stew pots, as if to say, "This was all very silly, and now I shall guard the memory of it." She became something of a symbol after that, not of victory, not even of peace, but of, well, presence. And so someone, possibly Beatrix the cook, or possibly a wandering minstrel with too much cider, declared that henceforth this day would be remembered as the Festival of the Golden Goose. Why golden, no one knows. Why a festival? Because someone already had bunting. And why Martha? Because she stayed perfectly still during the entire naming process and didn't bite anyone. It was decided. Preparations begin. Word spread quickly. Villagers, delighted by the idea of a festival that didn't involve mud wrestling or cabbage counting, began organizing at once. The baker began testing goose-shaped loaves. The tailor began sewing goose-themed tunics, mostly capes with beaks. The children were assigned to create goose masks, which, through a series of creative misunderstandings, ended up looking more like feathered pirates. No one minded. The first parade. On the first anniversary, as spring brushed soft green onto the hillsides, and the scent of thyme drifted lazily through the valley, the entire village gathered in the Field of Weeping Turnips for the inaugural Golden Goose Parade. At precisely 11 o'clock, or possibly 10:30, no one brought a clock. A band of fiddlers, flutists, and one man with a particularly squeaky shoe led the way. Behind them marched 3 children in an enormous goose costume. A cart decorated with golden ribbon carrying the original stew pots, now filled with flower arrangements. And Martha the goose resplendent in a tiny laurel crown carried proudly by two former squires. Lord Adalbert and Lord Torvald rode side by side on donkeys, waving like pageant queens and tossing bread rolls into the crowd. It was the slowest, most off-tempo, delightfully disorderly parade anyone had ever seen. The valley loved it. The great stew-off, the parade was only the beginning. At the heart of the festival was the great stew-off, a friendly, slightly competitive, and heavily sampled contest to determine who could prepare the tastiest stew that year. Adalbert's camp focused on precision. They brought calibrated ladles, measuring strings, and a team of professional goose whisperers. Torvald's camp emphasized flair. Their stew was flambéed, serenaded, and once briefly set on fire for theatrical purposes accidentally. The judges, a goat named Percival, very expressive, a librarian with no sense of taste, but strong opinions, and Marta the scribe, who had since retired and decided to speak only in rhymes. No one ever really won, but every year the audience declared it the best stew yet. Traditions take shape. As years passed, the Festival of the Golden Goose took on more rituals. The tossing of the turnips, a gentle game involving large baskets and very soft vegetables. Participants were encouraged to wear hats with feathers and yell honk at random intervals. The dance of the spoons, an interpretive group dance involving wooden utensils, goose masks, and absolutely no choreography. The annual recitation of the treaty, performed by village children who read the treaty aloud in exaggerated voices, adding sound effects and replacing all mentions of raisins with the word mystery orbs. And of course, the festival always ended the same way everyone gathered under the trees at dusk, with steaming bowls of stew, sitting together on blankets, and remembering the day when war was forgotten, because someone forgot to bring weapons. The lords grow older years passed gently. Lord Adalbert grew older, his mustache drooping slightly, his stew ever more refined. Lord Torvald's robes became simpler, his flair softening like butter in a warm pan. He still hummed as he cooked, though, especially when no one was listening. The two men, once rivals, grew into something else. Not quite friends. That word still felt too casual, too undignified. But companions, co-guardians of a shared tale. They met often not to duel or debate, but to taste and tinker. One year, they invented goose stew ice cream. It was a disaster. They laughed about it for months. When Torvald's hip began to ache in the cold, Adalbert lent him a wool cloak. When Adalbert forgot which herb went in which pot, Torvald labeled them in song. They never spoke of the almost war as a regret. Only as a reminder pride can stew too, but it's better shared. The day Martha flew. Martha, beloved goose of the valley, lived far longer than anyone expected. She waddled her way through 7 festivals, became the face of 3 commemorative banners, and once interrupted a wedding by sitting on the cake. And then, one morning, she was gone. No feathers, no footprints, no goodbyes. Just an open gate, and the faint sound of honking from the sky. Some said she flew. Others said she was carried off by the wind of wisdom, which visits all true legends. Adalbert simply nodded and poured a little cider into the grass. Torvald whispered, "She always did know when to make an exit." The next year, the festival included a moment of silence and a toast to Martha, honored now as Saint Goose of Peace, a legacy in laughter. And so, dear listener, the valley changed, slowly, softly, but deeply, not through war, not through conquest, but through laughter, through stew, through the small, strange miracle of two men deciding not to fight. The festival of the Golden Goose continued every year. Some came for the food, others came for the music, the turnip tossing the spoon, dancing. But most came for the feeling, that gentle goose-scented reminder that not all battles need blood, some just need broth. By the time the third festival of the Golden Goose rolled around with its edible ladle sculptures, stew-themed ballads, and turnip-rolling contests, word had finally reached beyond the sleepy hills of Thalendorf. Word reached the cities, the courts, the monasteries, and, unfortunately, the historians. Now, historians are a curious breed. They pride themselves on precision, but they do have a fondness for embellishment, particularly when a story is too odd to believe and far too charming to ignore. And so in dusty towers and candlelit chambers they began to write about a battle, a decisive one, with swords and bravery and absolutely no mention of cabbage. The first chronicle, the earliest known written record of the Battle of Thalendorf, appeared in a rather serious leather-bound volume titled Great Conflicts of the Northern Valleys, Volume 2, Blood and Glory. It described the event thusly. In the spring of 1323, the armies of Lord Adalbert and Lord Torvald clashed on the field of weeping turnips in a furious contest for culinary dominance. Blades rang, banners flew, and valor was measured in spoonfuls of steel. The ground was soaked with effort. The stew of destiny was stirred. Poetic, yes. Accurate not remotely. No spoons of steel existed. No blood was spilled. And the only thing soaked was a squire's boot when he accidentally stepped in a puddle of cider during the carrot toss. Still, the tale was copied, shared, quoted in university lectures by men who'd never cooked a stew in their lives. The glorification problem over time. The battle was painted with bolder strokes. One historian wrote that both lords rode into the field on white stallions' cloaks, billowing in the wind. They actually arrived by foot and donkey, respectively. Another claimed that the battle ended when Lord Adalbert's mighty war cry shattered a soup pot in midair. He had a cold that week and mostly just coughed. Yet another declared that Torvald's stew was declared so divine it caused a spontaneous ceasefire and brought tears to a passing falcon. There were no falcons, only one confused goose. And still the story grew. In a southern abbey, monks painted murals of armored knights, hurling flaming vegetables across fields like catapults. One dramatic carving in a town square depicted Lord Adalbert lifting a ladle like a sword toward the heavens, while angels wept into soup bowls. Needless to say, the people of Thalendorf found all of this extremely amusing. The locals respond. The villagers who remembered the actual day as one of the funniest afternoons of their lives began collecting the strangest misinterpretations. They posted them at the bakery. They recited them at the tavern. One tavern even began serving a drink called Historian's Regret, a mildly spicy cider meant to help wash down exaggerated nonsense. Adalbert himself once hosted a reading of The Siege of the Goose Lords, during which he had to stop 3 times to laugh into his soup. Torvald responded by staging a theatrical reenactment titled The Duel of the Stews, a Tragedy in Three Flavors. It starred children in oversized tunics arguing about bay leaves. The audience cried, mostly from laughing too hard. When the scholars arrived, eventually a group of well-meaning scholars from the capital decided to investigate the truth. They arrived in Thalendorf with clipboards, quills, and faces so serious they frightened a goose into hiding behind a wheelbarrow. They asked for records. They requested witness testimonies. They attempted to carbon date a spoon. Lord Adalbert offered them a bowl of stew and a nap. Lord Torvald handed them the original treaty and a slice of carrot cake. The scholars were skeptical. No one forgets their weapons, they said. No one ends a war with broth. And so they left muttering about local folklore and an obvious metaphor for economic trade agreements. They never returned. The truth becomes a joke. Over time, the people of the valley stopped trying to correct the record. Why bother? The truth, after all, was far less impressive to outsiders than a battle with swords and banners and noble speeches. But within Thalendorf, the truth lived on in every turnip toss, every laughter-filled stew-off, and every poorly carved goose statue. It became a kind of private joke. Visitors would arrive with wide eyes, expecting relics of war. Instead, they'd be offered warm bread and asked whether they preferred plum vinegar or saffron in their stew. They often left confused, but also very full. What the children were taught. Interestingly, the children of Thalendorf learned both versions. At school, they read from textbooks that featured overly dramatic illustrations of sword-wielding lords battling in dramatic moonlight. At home, their grandparents told them what really happened. About the missing weapons, the flying tomatoes, the goat that stole a hat, the scribe who drew a beet with a mustache in the treaty margins. They believed both, in a way. Because that's what legends are, isn't it? Part truth, part imagination, part very determined goose. One last correction. Years later, long after Adalbert and Torvald had passed, a quiet historian named Elspeth came to Thalendorf. She wore no cloak, carried no sword, only a small notebook and an open mind. She listened. She tasted the stew. She read the treaty. Then she wrote a new entry in her journal. Today I visited a place where war was avoided because someone forgot to pack weapons and no one really missed them. A place where two men stopped fighting long enough to share a recipe. They called it a battle, but it was perhaps the most peaceful war that never happened. That entry, written in quiet handwriting on a blank page, would one day be found in a museum, filed under miscellaneous, but read more than anything else. So, dear listener, if you ever find yourself reading history that sounds too dramatic, too perfect, too polished, remember Thalendorf, and know that sometimes the truest stories are the ones with soup stains and smiling geese. The historians got many things wrong, yes, but there was one detail they left out entirely. Not because it was too grand, but because it was too small. A detail that seemed trivial to outsiders, laughable even yet. Within the valley of Thalendorf, it became something of a hushed mystery, a quiet curiosity, a story whispered over stew pots and under soft blankets when the fire had grown low and the cider was nearly gone. It was about the spoons, more specifically, the missing ones. The vanishing begins. The first spoon went missing the night of the treaty signing. It was a large, well-worn ladle belonging to Beatrix, the cook, a favorite of hers, with a notch in the handle from years of faithful stirring. She left it near the fire after serving her famous leek and barley blend. And when she returned in the morning, it was gone, vanished, no trace. At first she blamed the goat. Goats are notorious for poor boundaries. But then Martha the scribe misplaced her ink spoon, used only to stir blackberry glaze, mind you, and it too disappeared without a trace. And then 2 soldiers discovered that their carved wooden eating spoons had vanished from their belts while they slept beneath a cabbage cart. By the end of the week, 9 spoons had mysteriously disappeared. All different sizes, all different owners, all gone. A growing rumor, people laughed at first. They blamed forgetfulness, carelessness, soup-induced sleepwalking. But the vanishings continued. A merchant visiting from the neighboring village claimed his silver tasting spoon, a family heirloom shaped like a fish, was taken right from his coat pocket. Even Lord Adalbert, famously organized and militantly tidy, lost his ceremonial soup spoon, the very one he had engraved with precision before parsley. It was enough to make him raise one eyebrow. And in Adalbert's world, that was practically a public scandal. The theories take shape. Soon the theories began. The practical theorists believed someone was simply collecting them, perhaps a local artist, planning a grand sculpture of peace and stew. The romantic theorists were convinced the spoons were being taken by a lovesick spirit, drawn to objects that had touched the lips of those in harmony. The conspiratorial theorists insisted the spoons were being hoarded by Lord Torvald in a secret tunnel as a long-term stew sabotage plot. Torvald, of course, was mildly offended. If I wanted to sabotage stew, he sniffed, I would just suggest raisins. The spoons, meanwhile, continued to vanish. The Spoon Watch. A group of eager children formed a secret society known as the Spoon Watch. They wore cloaks made of stitched-together napkins and held weekly meetings in the hollow of an old elm tree. They appointed roles: Spoon Seeker General, Minister of Broth Security, Commander of the Ladle Guard. They took turns watching over the communal stew pots with solemn expressions and sandwiches packed by their mothers. They never caught anyone, but they did start a popular chant. Where's the spoon? No one knows. Check your boots and check your toes. It didn't help, but it rhymed. The return. Then one foggy morning, nearly a year after the disappearances began, something changed. It happened just before dawn. An early rising baker stumbled into the town square and nearly tripped over a wooden crate sitting outside his shop. Inside the crate, spoons. Dozens of them. Old ones, new ones, carved, bent, engraved, plain. Every missing spoon, and more still. Some that no one even remembered losing. No note, no footprints, just spoons. And one more thing. Nestled among the utensils was a single feather. Long, soft, pure white. The whisper of the goose. There was only one creature in all of Thalendorf known for both subtlety and boldness in equal measure. Martha. Yes, Martha the goose. The same Martha who had once stood watch over the treaty, who had wandered freely between camps, who had once quite memorably honked so loudly during a debate over nutmeg that 2 scribes fell off their benches. But stealing spoons, it sounded absurd, and yet the signs were there. One child claimed to have seen her sneaking through the grass with something shiny in her beak. Another swore she once saw her staring longingly at a silver ladle like it held all the secrets of the stew. Even the goat seemed suspiciously quiet on the subject. A new tradition is born. No one ever proved it was Martha, but no one disproved it either. And so rather than be upset, the villagers chose, as Thalendorfians often did, to make it into something celebratory. The Night of the Vanishing Spoons became a new event at the Festival of the Golden Goose. Each year, children would leave a decorated spoon on their doorstep the night before the stew-off, hoping Martha or her descendants might deem it worthy of borrowing. Sometimes the spoons were gone by morning. Sometimes they were left exactly where they were. And sometimes they were returned a year later, with a tiny flower tucked inside. What it meant to outsiders, it was a silly tradition. To the people of Thalendorf, it was something else. A quiet reminder that even in peace, mystery could live. That not everything needed solving to be loved. That even a spoon, simple, humble, often overlooked, could carry meaning far beyond its weight. And perhaps if one listens very closely on those quiet mornings, you might still hear the soft clink of a spoon being gently lifted from a windowsill by a creature with feathers and impeccable taste. So sleep now, dear listener. Let your dreams be stirred, not shaken, with a wooden spoon handed down in laughter. And may your secrets, like the missing spoons, find their way home just when you've stopped searching. Every story in Thalendorf eventually finds its way to a goose. It's simply how things go in the valley. After all, the village's greatest moment, the battle that wasn't, was ended by stew and watched over by a goose. Martha, the dignified, crown-wearing, feather-ruffling bird who became both symbol and saint. But what many don't know, what even most villagers have forgotten, is that Martha was not the only goose who shaped the course of the valley's story. There was another. She was never given a name. Not officially. She arrived quietly without fanfare or fanfare players. She made no honking declarations. She wore no wreath. She simply appeared and stayed. And in staying, she changed things. The arrival, it was the fourth festival of the Golden Goose. The banners had been hung. The stew pots were already bubbling by mid-morning. Children wore oversized feather masks, and the spoon watch had been reinstated for ceremonial purposes, though they mostly just napped under trees. As Lord Adelbert prepared his speech, and Lord Torvald rehearsed his spoon-themed haiku, someone noticed a small, quiet goose standing near the edge of the field. Not a hatchling, not an elder, just a perfectly ordinary goose with pale gray feathers, black-tipped wings, and an oddly curious gaze. She didn't move much, didn't honk, just observed. People assumed she'd wandered in from one of the neighboring farms. Perhaps she was simply lost, but she didn't leave. The goose who chose no one. Unlike Martha, who had strongly favored stew shade and occasional dramatic entrances, this goose seemed entirely uninterested in attention. She wandered between stew pots, never pecking. She sat among the musicians without flapping a single wing. She was once spotted under Lord Adelbert's bench, and again under Torvald's hat stand. Children tried to name her. Suggestions included Gravy, Madame Bakerton, Feather McQuiet, the ghost of Soupmas past. But no name ever stuck. Every time someone tried to call her something, she simply turned away or wandered off. So they stopped trying, and she became fondly the goose who was never named. The subtle guardian. Strange things began to happen when she was around. Little things, gentle things. The kind that most would dismiss as coincidence, unless they'd lived in Thalendorf long enough to know better. A stew pot on the verge of tipping would right itself after she passed. Lost spoons reappeared near her resting spot, covered in dandelion fluff. A scribe's wind-blown notes were found unscattered under the very bench where she had slept. She seemed to glide where she pleased, interrupting nothing disturbing. No one but quietly ensuring that all things continued in calm, curious order. Even the weather obeyed her. On days she waddled out to the central field, the wind softened. The rain, if it came, was polite. A bond without words. Torvald was the first to speak to her. Not in commands, of course. He simply greeted her each morning like an old acquaintance. "Hello, feathered friend," he would say, bowing slightly. She never bowed back, but she never left either. Adalbert, skeptical at first, eventually took to placing a small saucer of warm water near his tent. The goose ignored it, but the saucer was always clean. One child, a girl named Ilsa, who rarely spoke, would sit near her with a small sketchbook. She never tried to pet the goose. She just drew. Always the same figure, a goose, standing between two hills' eyes, half-closed wings slightly lifted. Each drawing was slightly different. Each drawing somehow more peaceful than the last. The gentle disappearance. Then one year, just before the festival, the goose who was never named vanished. No feathers, no footprints, no confusion. She had simply been there the evening before, and then at dawn, she wasn't. The village searched gently, not with panic, not with urgency, but with a kind of wistful curiosity. Perhaps she had moved on. Perhaps she had finished what she came to do. No one could say. Even the goat, known for its loud opinions, seemed unusually quiet that morning. What was left behind? In the spot where she often sat, the grass grew slightly thicker that spring. A ring of clover bloomed there, small white blossoms that never wilted during the week of the festival. Children began calling it the sitting circle, and it became a quiet place, free from shouting or racing or turnip rolling. A year later, a tiny curved stone was discovered at the center. It bore no carvings, no markings, but it fit perfectly in the palm and felt warm even on cold mornings. Some believed it was her egg. Others said it was just a stone shaped by time. Most simply smiled, placed it back, and let it be. Her role in the story. What was she really? A messenger, a guardian, a goose with excellent timing. No one ever knew. But her presence became part of the valley's rhythm. Each festival, during the quiet hour before the stew was served, someone would always set out an empty bowl near the sitting circle. Not with expectation, just respect. And every year, a breeze would rustle through the trees as if in response. A breeze that smelled faintly of thyme parsley and something older, something feathered, something nameless. The story as it's told. Today in bedtime stories they now say, Martha ended the war, but the goose who was never named kept it ended. It doesn't quite make sense. But then again, neither does a war fought with onions. In Thalendorf, they know that not all heroes honk. Some simply stay. And then one day they go, leaving nothing behind except calm. So if you ever sit by a stew pot and feel a sudden hush, or if a spoon turns up just when you thought it lost, you might smile to yourself and think, she's still watching, just quietly. Time, as it always does, wandered on. The seasons in Thalendorf changed, like slow dancers, autumn brushing, golden against spring winters, arriving with soft woolen hushes, summers arriving late, but bringing strawberries. And somewhere in that rhythm, the story of the great unarmed battle began to settle. Not fade, not disappear, but settle like flour into stew. No one forgot, not really, but the way they remembered softened. And so the valley did what valleys do best. It slept, not from exhaustion, not from boredom, but from the comfort of knowing it had become something more than just land between hills. It had become a story. The children know it. First, children, of course, are the first to recognize when a place becomes a legend. They play where history once stood, with games that look nothing like the truth, but feel exactly right. In the meadows where vegetables once flew, they pretend to ride carrots into battle. They wear ladles as helmets. They duel with wooden spoons. They shout things like, "You'll never take my stew, villain," and then they collapse into giggles and lie on their backs, arms spread wide, looking at clouds shaped like soup pots. Their laughter is light, untroubled, unaware of the weight their joy carries. That's how legends grow after all, not by remembering every detail, but by living as if the best parts were still happening. The elders pretend to forget. The older folks, meanwhile, do their part by pretending to forget. They raise their eyebrows when tourists ask about the great battle. They say things like, "Wasn't much of a battle, more of a spirited disagreement, with parsnips." They smile softly when asked about Martha, or the sitting circle, or the stew treaty. They say, "Ah, that was all a very long time ago. Are you hungry?" And then they pass you a bowl of soup, which tastes suspiciously like a story. They know the legend lives best when it's not prodded too much. Let it rest. Let it warm the belly. Let it simmer slowly as legends do. The hills remain. The hills on either side of the valley haven't changed much. Trockenberg still stands tall in the east, its square towers now dotted with moss and the occasional pigeon. The Adalbert family still tends to their geese, though with far less shouting. Grunwald remains fragrant in the west, its paths lined with thyme and sweet onion. The Torvald line, still prone to dramatic gestures, now hosts seasonal cooking contests judged by local goats. Between them, the field of weeping turnips rests peacefully, no longer a field for soldiers, but for weddings. Cider dances and poetry recitals so bad, they've become an attraction in their own right. Each year, the field blooms with wildflowers that seem suspiciously well organized, almost as if someone invisible is still tending it. Some say that's the work of the goose who was never named. Others say it's just the wind. No one argues. The festival lives on the Festival of the Golden Goose continues, of course. Every year it returns like clockwork, though no one uses a clock. It simply begins when the stew starts to smell just right, and someone declares, "Well, I suppose it's time again." There are parades and stew-offs, and the ceremonial tossing of the ceremonial turnip, which has never once landed where it was intended to. The children still wear feathered masks. The elders still sit on creaky stools and pretend not to cry when the old treaty is read aloud in rhyming couplets by a new batch of wide-eyed narrators. And every year, someone leaves a spoon at the sitting circle. Sometimes it's taken, sometimes it's left. Sometimes, mysteriously, it returns with a single wildflower tucked into its curve. They never ask why. Visitors from elsewhere. People still visit now and then. They come with cameras and notebooks and furrowed brows. They ask things like, "But where was the main battleground? Who was the commanding general? What was the casualty count?" The villagers smile and hand them soup. Then they tell them the story, softly, gently, sometimes all at once, sometimes in pieces. And the visitors laugh or scoff, or every now and then fall quiet. Because somewhere in the telling, they realize this story is not about stew, or pride, or geese. It's about what didn't happen. It's about what was forgotten on purpose. The final truth. So what was Thalendorf really? A place? Yes, a story. Also, yes, a reminder, absolutely. A reminder that not all legends are about dragons and kings and war cries. Some legends begin with two lords forgetting their weapons, with vegetables flying through the air, with goats wandering through treaties, with a spoon left under moonlight, with a goose who said nothing but somehow said everything. And the truth, if you must have it, is this. The greatest peace in Thalendorf's history came not from power, but from pause. Not from bravery, but from broth. Not from conquest, but from forgetting what they were supposed to do. And so the valley sleeps now. When night falls over Thalendorf, it falls gently. The meadows exhale, the turnips sigh. The trees nod in time with the stars. And somewhere, perhaps, near the sitting circle, or beneath a forgotten stew pot, or on the breeze that rustles the goose-feathered flags, there's the faintest sound. A soft clink, like a spoon, settling into a bowl. So rest, dear listener. Let the valley tuck you in. Let your thoughts simmer down. Let your breath follow the rhythm of hills that learn to sleep through legend. And know that sometimes the greatest tales are the ones that almost didn't happen at all. Long after the great unarmed battle, and long after the goose named Martha, and the goose, who was never named, had left their soft footprints across Thalendorf's history, something strange began to stir. Not dangerous, not dreadful, just strange. It started as most peculiar things do in Thalendorf with a turnip. Not an ordinary turnip, mind you. This one had a face. The farmer who found it, old Emmerich, was not a man of drama. He had farmed the same plot of land for 42 years. He wore the same boots mended 17 times. He said little smiled less, and considered a sneeze to be an unnecessary display of emotion. So when Emmerich came into the village one Tuesday morning, holding a turnip and whispering, "It told me not to boil it," people paid attention. He cradled the vegetable like a relic. Its purple-white skin was marked with curious folds lines that, if viewed from a certain angle, did indeed resemble a face. One brow arched, a faint suggestion of a smirk, the ghost of a mustache. It was the most expressive root vegetable anyone had ever seen. And Emmerich, usually calm, usually uninterested in nonsense, refused to eat it. The oracle is born soon. The turnip was placed on display in the village square. At first, people came to laugh, then to stare, and then to ask questions. No one was quite sure how it started. But villagers began kneeling in front of the turnip and whispering their worries about stew recipes, about goose behavior, about whether to plant cabbage or kale. Sometimes they swore the turnip changed its expression, frowning slightly or raising its invisible brow. One baker said she asked it whether she should marry the widowed cheesemaker from up the hill. She claims the turnip's mouth curved upward that day. She married the cheesemaker. They're still together. Their wedding cake was made of brie. The turnip gets a tent. Eventually, it became awkward to have people whispering at a vegetable in the open air, so the town built a small tent. Modest, of course. Just a canvas shelter with soft straw flooring and a table made from a soup crate. They called it the Temple of Rooted Wisdom, though many still referred to it fondly as Turnip Corner. Inside the turnip was placed on a plush cushion surrounded by lavender and parsley. A tiny sign was added, one question per visit. No yelling, no peeling. People respected it, mostly. The warning comes. Then came the day the turnip turned. Not physically, of course, but somehow its face shifted. Slightly more stern, less smirk, more warning. No one could explain it. That evening, a small scroll appeared beside it. No one saw who placed it there. Some said it hadn't been there that afternoon. Others said they saw a blur of feathers in the shadows. The scroll read, "Beware the day the stew grows cold in the pot, when geese refuse to honk, when spoons lie silent, for then the warmth will fade, and Thalendorf will forget what it once remembered." Naturally, this caused a mild panic. Interpretations abound. The stew council was convened immediately. Everyone had different interpretations. The pessimists feared a stew shortage was imminent. The romantics believed it meant a goose prophecy would be fulfilled. The practical farmers wondered if the warning was about weather patterns and soup insulation. Torvald's great-grandniece declared dramatically, "It means we must never let the stew go cold again. We must keep the fire burning through the night." She was quickly made head of stew temperature affairs. A small hut was built next to the central pot to house a candle that never went out. Lord Adalbert's grandson, now a quiet librarian who wore only beige, suggested the scroll was a metaphor for declining civic participation. He was ignored, but kindly offered tea. The great spoon whispering begins. Fearing further warnings from the vegetable realm, villagers began whispering not just to the turnip, but to their spoons. They would lean in after meals and murmur, "Thank you for your service. Please stay warm. Are you happy in your drawer?" One elderly man claimed his spoon answered by vibrating slightly. He was very excited until it turned out his table was uneven. Nevertheless, the Spoon Appreciation Society was formed. Membership required one polished spoon, a quiet heart, and a vow never to clank carelessly. They met weekly. They hosted potlucks. They spoke only in whispers. Was it ever real? Skeptics, a small but persistent group, argued the whole thing was nonsense. They believed Emmerich had simply found a funny-looking turnip and had a dream after eating too much beet salad. They argued the scroll could have been written by a mischievous bard or an over-imaginative goose enthusiast. But when they tried to remove the turnip from its cushion, they couldn't. It was heavy, too heavy, not in weight, in presence. They all stepped back, nodded awkwardly, and decided not to touch it again. The tradition continues. Now every year before the festival of the Golden Goose, a silent procession takes place. Villagers line up to visit the turnip oracle. They leave tiny gifts, time bundles, polished pebbles, drawings from children. Some ask questions. Most just sit quietly. And each year the stew is served just a little hotter. The spoons clink just a little softer. And every goose somehow honks at least once in perfect harmony. What it all means, no one really knows. Maybe the turnip oracle is just a vegetable. Maybe the scroll was a prank. Maybe Martha returned in another form. Maybe legends grow roots of their own and sprout wherever they're needed most. But in Thalendorf, people don't ask too many questions. Not when the stew is warm. Not when the air smells like rosemary and laughter. Not when peace feels planted. So they tend to the turnip. They stir the soup. They whisper to their spoons. And they remember that sometimes the most important warnings are the ones that help you keep things simple, like warmth, like kindness, like stew that never goes cold. So rest now, dear listener. Let your thoughts be as quiet as a spoon resting in broth. And if you dream of vegetable speaking, don't be alarmed. It just means you've been listening closely. In most villages, goats are known for eating laundry climbing on things they shouldn't, and occasionally making eye contact with the kind of intensity usually reserved for philosophers and tax collectors. In Thalendorf, however, goats had always been different, more polite, more observant, still prone to chewing on socks, but with a certain dignity. And among them, one goat stood apart. His name was Percival. He had no special markings, no rare breed, no history of winning ribbons. He was simply a goat who watched a lot. And one unforgettable spring morning, he took command of the village. Sort of a regular morning. It began like most days in Thalendorf. The sun was rising at its usual leisurely pace. The bakers were pulling fresh loaves from their stone ovens. The goose known as Matilda was already preening herself in the fountain. And Percival stood, as he often did, near the base of the central flagpole, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of thistle. He didn't make noise. He didn't move. He simply stared. And as anyone in Thalendorf would tell you, when Percival stared, things tended to happen. The council collapses. At precisely 9 o'clock, the village council convened to discuss an urgent matter, whether the stew served during the upcoming Golden Goose Festival should include marjoram, or whether it was, as Councillor Berta claimed, an herb best left to dreams. Debate quickly spiraled out of control. By 9, the 17 chairs had been overturned. By 9:21, someone had stormed out holding a ladle like a sword. By 9:23, the minutes recorder had thrown up her hands and gone outside to hug a tree. And at 9:24, the stew pot, completely unattended, boiled over. Into the chaos walked Percival. The goat ascends. He entered the meeting hall without ceremony. He walked slowly past the overturned chair, past the smoldering stew, past the pile of herbs being sorted into good, maybe, and what is that? And then, with the grace of a weary monarch, Percival climbed onto the center table. He stood there, silent, steady, and deeply unimpressed. Everyone stopped talking. Even the ladle wielder lowered her arm. The goat blinked, then let out a single precise "mmm." It echoed through the room like a verdict, a strange sort of authority. From that moment on, no one quite knew what to do, but also no one dared to interrupt him. Percival didn't give orders. He didn't write decrees. He didn't even move much. He simply remained present. And things began to shift. Arguments slowed, voices softened. The herbs were resorted. Marjoram was moved to a bowl labeled optional but lovely. When someone dropped a spoon, Percival turned his head. Slowly, the person apologized to the spoon. Word spreads. By midday, word had reached the entire village. The goat has taken over the council. Percival fixed the stew committee. He's staring at people until they make better choices. Children peeked into the windows of the hall. Farmers arrived to offer him apples. One merchant left a tiny crown made of lavender near his hooves. Percival ignored it all. He stood firm, occasionally shifting his weight or blinking contemplatively as if mulling over some deep and invisible truth. And no one questioned him. The unexpected peace. By afternoon, things had reached a new level of calm. Disagreements were solved with gentle nods. Scribes wrote faster and neater. The stew was back to a gentle simmer, seasoned perfectly with marjoram included in the open table toppings section. One counselor cried softly, overcome by the sheer lack of shouting. At 300 p.m., someone rang the town bell in celebration, then rang it again to apologize for being loud. Percival blinked once and resumed staring at a wall, as if it had disappointed him personally. The goat had become a presence, not a leader. Not exactly, but a force, a new kind of leadership. For the rest of the week, the village simply adjusted. Whenever a decision felt difficult, someone would ask, what would Percival do? Then they'd sit quietly for a moment, and the answer somehow came. A new sign was added above the council chamber door. Silence before, stew clarity after goat. No one knew what it meant, but it felt right. A gentle exit. On the 7th day of his occupation, visitation, silent reign, Percival climbed down from the table, walked slowly to the door, and trotted back into the meadow. He lay down beside the fountain and resumed chewing grass. Just like that, it was over. He never returned to the hall again. But the silence lingered. The soft sense of enough. The understanding that sometimes the best way to fix a mess is not with louder words, but with none at all. The goat's legacy. From that day forward, every council meeting in Thalendorf began with a minute of silence. Not a forced one, not ceremonial, just space, time to think, time to breathe, time to ask, what would the goat disapprove of? A small stone statue of Percival was placed in the garden. Not large, just big enough to lean against when life felt too noisy. Children left it dandelions. Old folks whispered thanks to it before walking home. And every now and then, someone swore they saw the real Percival watching from a distant hill, not ruling, just reminding. So now, dear listener, when life feels too loud, or your stew tastes slightly off, or people keep talking over each other, perhaps it's time for a moment of Percival. Not to command, not to correct, just to be still. And sometimes stillness is the clearest command of all. Long after the goat's silent reign and many festivals after the day, the turnip offered its warning. A curious event took place in the kitchens of Thalendorf. It didn't involve parades or prophecies or particularly dramatic livestock. It involved a spoon. One spoon, made of wood, sturdy, unremarkable, and up until that year, extremely dependable. But then one chilly morning in early spring, it simply stopped stirring. The spoon in question. The spoon belonged to old Jorah, the village's most senior soup maker. Jorah had been ladling, stirring, tasting, and seasoning for so many decades that some villagers were convinced he was partially made of broth himself. His kitchen was a place of peace, always warm, always humming, always filled with the scent of sage and stories. The spoon, affectionately called Maple, had been his trusted companion since his apprentice days. Its bowl had been worn smooth by time, its handle curved slightly to one side, the result of a tumble into a cider barrel sometime in year 33. It never splintered, never cracked, never stirred too fast or too slow, until the day it refused. The refusal. It happened in the middle of carrot turnip bisque. Jorah dipped the spoon in, gave one gentle swirl, and it stopped. Just stopped. Not stiff, not stuck, but somehow resistant. Heavy, almost. Like it had decided quite politely that it would go no further. Jorah, baffled, tried again. The spoon remained still, resting diagonally across the pot like a weary pilgrim. He tried another pot, a broth, then a stew. Nothing! Jorah blinked. He cleaned the spoon, whispered encouragement, gave it a gentle rub with thyme oil. Still nothing. The spoon would not stir. The kitchen reacts. Jorah, being a calm sort of person, didn't panic. Instead, he brewed a cup of nettle tea, placed the spoon beside it, and sat down for a long think. Word, however, spread quickly. Within an hour, half the village had arrived to witness the event. By sunset, it had been officially named the Spoon Who Refused to Stir. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was wise. A few believed it had simply earned the right to retire. The theories stir naturally. Everyone had opinions. The stew philosophers declared the spoon was meditating and must not be disturbed. The Spoon Watch, still active, still wearing napkin capes, claimed it was testing the purity of Thalendorf's cooking spirit. One young baker insisted the spoon was haunted by a forgotten recipe and could not rest until it was completed. A poet stood outside the kitchen and shouted, "The spoon is a mirror, and we, the broth." No one knew what that meant, but they clapped anyway. Jorah tries again. The next morning, Jorah brought Maple back to the pot. He spoke softly. "You've stirred through every celebration, every mistake, every first bite and second try. If you're done, I understand. But if there's something I need to learn, tell me." He dipped the spoon. Nothing? So Jorah nodded and placed it gently in a velvet-lined drawer beside a folded note that read, "When you're ready." Then he picked up a different spoon. Not quite the same, but it stirred. The soup that day was fine, but everyone agreed it didn't taste exactly like home. The dreams begin. That night, several villagers reported dreams, each one different, but each featuring a spoon floating in the air, whispering things like, "Too much nutmeg, peace lies in gentle circles. Let the stew settle." One woman claimed she dreamed of a council of spoons debating whether humanity deserved seasoning at all. Another woke up and immediately planted a bay leaf tree. Whether connected to Maple or not, no one could say. But the dreams continued. A visit from the goose. On the third day of the spoon's stillness, a goose arrived. Not one of the usual village geese. This one wore a single feather of silver gray. Its eyes were calm, ancient. It walked into Jorah's kitchen. No one stopped it. It peered into the pot, looked at the spoon drawer, then very gently nudged the handle with its beak. Nothing dramatic happened. No light, no music. But Jorah smiled. He placed Maple back on the counter, not to stir, just to rest. The goose left. As quietly as it had come, a new way to stir. From then on, Jorah stirred differently. He didn't rush. He didn't swirl automatically. He stirred with presence, with pause, with intention. He invited others to join him, children, elders, even shy travelers. Each one was given a spoon. Each one stirred once. The soup began to taste richer, deeper, not because of salt, but because of stillness. And Maple watched, resting nearby, always present, sometimes trembling ever so slightly as if remembering. A spoon's retirement. Eventually, a small glass case was placed near the town's central hearth. Inside it, Maple, resting on a cushion of soft herbs. Above it, a sign. This spoon stirred peace into our story. When it stopped, we remembered how to taste. People visited it in silence. Sometimes they left a sprig of thyme. Sometimes they whispered apologies for overboiling things. No one ever touched it, but everyone learned from it. The lesson of the spoon. No one ever discovered why Maple stopped stirring. Some believed it was a protest. Others thought it was a quiet gift, a reminder that even the most faithful of tools needs rest. But most agreed it taught them something far more important than seasoning. That sometimes stillness is wiser than motion. That even soup deserves patience. That peace begins when we stop stirring just long enough to listen. Even if the message comes from a piece of wood with a worn-down handle. So now, dear listener, if you ever find your thoughts stirring too fast, if the world feels rushed or your mind won't settle, hold still. Let the broth swirl on its own. Let your spoon rest. And when you're ready, gently, slowly stir once. Just once. It may be enough. There is a recipe known in Thalendorf that no one ever writes down. Not because it's a secret, not because it's forgotten, but because it can only be made once. It's called the last recipe. No one really knows who made it first. Some say it was Jorah, the old soup master, long after the spoon who refused to stir rested in its glass case. Others say it was Martha the goose whispered to a baker in a dream. One child claims they heard it spoken by a turnip just before harvest. No one can confirm that, but everyone agrees the last recipe isn't a dish. It's a moment. The ingredients are time. The recipe begins with nothing. Not a pot, not a ladle, not a single slice of onion. Just stillness. You must wait until the moment calls you. It won't arrive loudly. It comes like a slow breath, or the smell of soup drifting through the air from a place you haven't found yet. You'll know it because your hands will pause, because your heart will feel oddly full, because someone will look at you not expecting anything and smile. That's when you begin. And you'll need only 3 things. A memory you can taste, a quiet fire, and someone to share it with. How it's prepared. The last recipe isn't stirred, it's coaxed. First, you gather what you have. Not what's best, not what's expensive, just what's yours. Some bring turnips, others bring stories. Some bring bread, others bring silence. One man brought a single clove and said it was from the day he forgave someone. It was enough. You place everything in the pot not all at once but slowly, with intention, with gratitude, with the awareness that this is the last time these ingredients will ever meet. And when the fire is lit, you don't watch the flame. You watch the people near it. Their hands, their eyes, the way they lean in without realizing. Because the last recipe is not meant to be eaten in a hurry. It's meant to be noticed. The day it was made. The last time it was officially prepared in Thalendorf was the eve of the 50th Festival of the Golden Goose. The valley had grown since the early days. New homes stood where the soldiers once camped. The field of weeping turnips had been renamed affectionately as the Field of Whispering Soup. The original stew pots, now bronze with age, rested beneath flowering arches. One had daisies growing inside it. The other held rainwater and reflected the sky. That evening the villagers gathered without summons. No one rang a bell. No one waved a flag. They simply knew. And in the center of the square, someone lit a small fire. One by one, they came forward one by one. An old woman placed a pinch of rosemary in the pot. For the letter I never sent, she said. A boy offered a bit of honey. For the times someone forgave me. A man in a cloak laid down 3 small potatoes. For my brother, who once called me home. Someone added an old coin. Someone added a feather. Someone quietly added a tear. No one laughed. No one questioned. The stew began to shimmer, not with light, but with presence. The silence that followed. When it was done, no one declared it. They simply stopped adding and waited. And in that pause, that gentle exhale of a moment, too full for words, they did what no recipe could ever describe. They remembered, not the events, not the dates, not even the goose-related disagreements. They remembered each other, how it felt to share, how it felt to listen, how it felt to belong in a story no one owned, but everyone held. And when the stew was served, it was only by ladle. No bowls, just one ladle passed from hand to hand. Each person took one sip, closed their eyes, and handed it on. No one saved the stew. They didn't store it, didn't write it down, didn't preserve a sample in a jar on a shelf. It was never meant to be kept, only felt. Only known, only held briefly like breath before a laugh, like warmth before sleep. And when the last sip was taken, the pot was cleaned in silence. The fire was let go with thanks, and the ladle was set gently beside the case where maple rested. A small note was added. This one stirred the end. Since then, no one has made the last recipe again. Not really, but sometimes it's felt in the pause before a toast, in the scent of soup that tastes like memory, in the way 2 people laugh at the same time and then go quiet just for a moment, knowing they've shared something neither of them can name. Some say the last recipe is a kind of magic. Others say it's just what happens when you put kindness in a pot. But in Thalendorf, they know better. It's not the pot. It's not the soup. It's not even the goose. It's the moment. So now, dear listener, as you close your eyes and your breath slows, may you feel the weight of a wooden spoon perfectly balanced. May you sense the steam curling upward from a pot you never saw but always knew. And may you know, without needing proof, that once in a valley not so far from dreams, they made a stew that wasn't for hunger, but for remembering. And it was enough. Not everything in Thalendorf was out in the open. Some stories were told in kitchens, others in festivals, and some were whispered to geese or turnips or gently smoldering stew pots. But there were stories, deep, careful ones that lived beneath the surface. Literally, because beneath the oldest kitchen in the village, just under the floorboards of the original stone hearth, where the very first festival stew was stirred by candlelight and cider, there lay something few had ever seen. A library, not the grand kind, not filled with rows of scrolls or marble statues of wise people holding books they never read. This was a ladle library. How it was found. It was discovered quietly accidentally by a young apprentice named Lena, who had been tasked with cleaning the kitchen hearth after the 52nd festival of the Golden Goose. Tired, covered in flour, and determined not to scrub anything more than necessary, she dropped her rag behind the woodpile and reached to retrieve it, only to hear a soft clunk. She pulled aside a loose stone, expecting a mouse or an old root. Instead, she found a tiny iron hatch, circular with a carved wooden ladle at its center and a faint inscription around the rim. Only those who stir with care may enter. Being a rather thoughtful stirrer herself, Lena turned the ladle clockwise, once, then twice. The hatch clicked and opened. What was inside? Beneath the hatch lay a narrow spiral stair, carved not from stone, but from layered wood, like tree rings guiding you inward. At the bottom, Lena found warmth. The air was thick with the scent of sage old pages, and a strange, pleasant smell like roasted onion and candle wax. Shelves lined the walls, not with books, but with spoons. Dozens, hundreds, each one mounted carefully labeled in neat handwriting. Some plain, some chipped, some etched with golden filigree or faded initials. And in the center, a round table with one cushion. On the table lay a journal open to a single sentence. This is the place where stirring becomes remembering. The spoons that spoke. Lena was not a foolish girl. She didn't touch anything right away. She simply sat, waited. Then she listened. And the room responded. It didn't speak in voices. Not exactly, but in flavors. As she sat there, she felt things, not emotions exactly, but memories steeped in warmth. The chipped wooden spoon in the corner brought the smell of soup cooked by a nervous father trying to calm a colicky baby. The silver spoon with the tulip engraving offered the quiet pride of someone cooking alone for the first time and not burning anything. The crooked copper ladle near the back sent a wave of grief, and then relief, and then a single clean breath of time. Each spoon carried a story, not written, not told, felt. A library of moments. Lena came back the next day, and the day after. She began cataloging the spoons by emotion. Hopeful, mournful, gently regretful, steadfast, sleepy. She created her own section called Stews of Second Chances. It had 11 spoons. Soon others joined her. Quiet folk, kind folk, people who understood that some stories don't need words. They didn't take the spoons. They simply sat with them, listened, and sometimes, when moved, they'd leave a new spoon behind, wrapped in cloth, whittled by hand, carved from a tree that fell during a storm that brought someone home. How the library changed. The village news of the Ladle Library spread slowly. Not because it was secret, but because no one wanted to explain it. You don't explain a sunset. You don't explain the smell of soup. When you've been away too long, you just feel it. So the library became a place people visited when they had nothing left to say, but everything left to feel. A baker left a spoon when her father passed, carved from his breadboard. A traveler left one shaped like a question mark. A baby, once grown, returned as an old man and left the spoon his mother used to stir chamomile. The spoon that grew. One day, Lena discovered a spoon she hadn't seen before. It was made of ash wood, still green at the edges, and it hummed softly. It didn't vibrate or shine. It just resonated. She sat with it for a long time. When she returned the next day, it had grown. Not by much, but it was longer, smoother. Each time someone sat near it with quiet in their heart, it grew a little more, until it became a ladle, then a staff, and eventually a tree. No one planted it, but one day the floor cracked and a sapling grew from the center of the room. It bore wooden leaves and the scent of broth. No one stopped it. A place that needs no guard, the library beneath the ladle was never locked. There was no need. No one took more than they left. No one spoke too loudly. And even the goats, when occasionally wandering down, walked gently and didn't nibble. Some say the goose, who was never named, visited once curled beside the growing spoon tree and dozed for a whole afternoon. It was the quietest the roots ever were. The final shelf. There is one shelf near the back. It's small, unmarked. It holds only one spoon. No label, no scent, just smooth, warm wood. Some say it's waiting. Some say it's the first spoon carved before anyone remembered to remember. Others say it's the last, meant to stir the final stew when the valley forgets how to taste. No one touches it, but sometimes they sit beside it and feel whole. So, dear listener, as you rest tonight, know this. There is a place beneath the kitchen, beneath the festivals, beneath the noise. A quiet library of spoons. A place where stories aren't told but held, where soup remembers, and you are never alone. Because every spoon stirs something, even if only once, and that is enough. In Thalendorf, stories are usually stirred. Someone begins them, someone adds a detail, someone else gives them a bit of spice, or maybe just a knowing look. And then, like a good soup, they simmer and deepen until they're ready to be served. But there is one story that was never quite stirred by anyone. It stirred itself, and for the people of the valley, that story was the rarest kind, the kind that arrives already warm. The story with no author. It didn't appear in a book, or on a scroll, or chiseled into a stone behind the bakery where children dared each other to talk to the garlic barrels. No one wrote it. No one claimed it. But one morning, it was simply there, a single sheet of parchment resting on the doorstep of the Ladle Library. The wind had folded its corners softly, and it smelled faintly of mint and ash wood. Lena was the one who found it. She almost didn't notice it, a tiny slip, barely catching the edge of her boot, as she passed through the wooden door with an armful of fresh spoon offerings. She picked it up and read the title. The story that stirred itself. Nothing more. No name, no date, no ink blot or smudged corner, just perfect patient letters like they had been waiting to be read. What the story said, no one could remember all of it, but those who read it felt as if they had already known it. It spoke of a village, a quiet one, filled with turnips and geese and arguments about marjoram. It spoke of a stew so warm it stopped a war. of a spoon that chose to stop, of a goat who led without speaking, of a goose who left with the wind. It spoke of laughter that softened the earth and silence that taught people how to listen again. And it ended with this: some stories are told, some are cooked, but the best ones stir themselves when you are still enough to taste them. The parchment vanishes. The parchment stayed on the table in the ladle library for 3 days. People came and read it quietly. Some nodded, some cried. One child tried to draw a goose on the corner, but stopped sensing somehow that it was already complete. On the 4th day, it was gone. No one saw it taken. In its place was a single silver spoon, unmarked, unlabeled, resting across a bowl of water that rippled gently without wind. What the villagers decided. They didn't search for the author. They didn't try to rewrite the tale or publish it or embellish it with banners and songs, though one fiddler did attempt a musical adaptation involving interpretive spoon dancing, which was lovingly booed off stage. Instead, they treated the story the way one treats a rare herb, used only when needed, preserved through memory, passed down with warmth, not urgency. From that day forward, when someone in Thalendorf reached a moment of decision, one of those quiet forks in the road that life stirs up, sometimes they would pause and ask, is this the kind of moment that stirs itself? And if the answer was yes, they knew to listen more than speak. The story travels. Of course, stories like that never stay in one place. A traveler once stopped in Thalendorf, weary and full of questions. He heard the story from a quiet woman at the edge of the festival crowd. She offered it between spoonfuls of plum stew without flourish or expectation. When he left the next morning, he carried the story with him. He told it to a librarian 3 villages over. That librarian folded it into a lullaby for her daughter. The daughter later told it to her own child, who whispered it to a flock of birds, who carried it on their wings into the wind, where it curled softly around campfires and rainy porches and overworked kitchens across the world. And wherever it landed, people didn't quite remember how it began, but they remembered how it made them feel. In the end, the story of Thalendorf didn't end with a bang, or a wedding, or a dramatic last ladle lifted into the sky. It ended the way stories should, with people still living in it, still stirring stew, still whispering to spoons, still planting herbs by windowsills, and honoring geese who taught them when to leave and when to stay. And every once in a while, someone would say, I heard this strange story once about a battle with no weapons. And someone else would nod and smile and say, ah, yes, that old tale. You know, I think it stirs itself. And just like that, it would begin again. The final ladle. In the deepest part of the ladle library beneath the tree, grown from silence, there is a ladle no one stirs with. It rests in a stone cradle, warm to the touch, though no fire ever reaches it. Some say it belonged to the first stew. Others say it hasn't been used yet, that it's waiting for the day a story too big for words stirs the world awake. No one dares to lift it. No one needs to. Because even now, as people sleep with stories in their bellies and laughter in their bones, that ladle moves gently, just once, then settles again. So rest now, dear listener. Let your thoughts settle like herbs at the bottom of broth. Let the warmth of Thalendorf curl beneath your blanket like a sleepy goat. Let your own story, strange and quiet, and perfectly yours, stir itself through your dreams. And know this, even the softest tale can leave the deepest flavor, especially when it stirs itself. If you're still awake, then maybe the story hasn't really ended yet. Some people don't fall asleep to escape their day. Some people stay awake just a little longer to sit quietly with the story that sat quietly with them. If that's you, then this part is only for you. When the story grows quiet, there's something no one in Thalendorf ever said out loud. The most beautiful part of any story is not the beginning. It's not even the ending. It's the moment, just after the ending, when the voice falls quiet, when the fire in the hearth softens to embers, when no one is speaking, but the warmth is still there. You're still here listening, and that matters, because every story wants someone to stay with it, to hold the silence, to gently carry the last breath of it into sleep. And that someone is you. Not all goodbyes are loud. This isn't a grand farewell. There's no ribbon to tie, no curtain to close. Just a spoon resting gently in a bowl. Just a breeze turning the last page. Just a whisper not to leave, but to rest. Because the story isn't gone. It's just full now, like a pot that simmered long enough. It doesn't need more words. It just needs someone to remember how it felt. You were part of it. You might not realize this, but while you listened, you stirred the story too. With every breath, every smile, every small ache in your chest. When something quiet and true reached you, you were the warmth. You were the stillness. You were the space the story filled. And stories remember the ones who stayed. The quiet magic of staying. Some people will hear this tale and smile. Some will forget it by morning. But the ones who stayed, who let the story finish in its own time, they carry it differently. Like a favorite mug, chipped but warm. Like a song with no chorus, but a feeling that lingers. Like a friend who didn't need to say much, just needed to sit beside you for a while. You stayed, and that changed everything. Just a little closer. So here we are, you, me, and the breath between words. There's nothing more to explain. No more twists. No last-minute goose surprise, though. That would be very Thalendorf of us. There's only this, a soft, unseen hand placing the story gently into your lap. Still warm, still glowing a little from the inside, and entirely yours now. To carry, to revisit, or to let go, however you need it. One last thought. If the world feels too loud tomorrow, if you find yourself searching for peace in the clatter and rush, just remember this. There's a valley where spoons sleep, where goats lead wisely, where stories stir themselves, and where a single bowl of soup once held enough warmth to stop a war. And that place, quiet, impossible, gentle lives in you now. You are a keeper of warmth, of listening, of late hours and last sentences. You are a final page turned with love. So sleep now, dear listener, not to leave, but to arrive, into rest, into dreams, into the hush where stories wait to meet you again. And if you ever wonder whether it mattered that you stayed to the very end, it did. More than you know. Good night, and thank you.